What if history had taken another path? What if one moment had changed everything? On this channel, we explore the worlds that never were. Welcome to Alternate History.
In 1347, a fleet of merchant ships arrived in Sicily from the Black Sea. The sailors were dying, their bodies covered in black boils, oozing blood and pus. Within days, the disease spread through the port. Within months, it consumed all of Europe. The Black Death, the deadliest pandemic in human history. Between 1347 and 1353, it killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people. That's 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population, gone in 6 years. But here's what most people don't realize. The Black Death didn't just kill millions. It completely restructured European society. It ended feudalism. It triggered the Renaissance. It gave birth to the modern world. What if those ships never arrived? What if the Black Death never happened? Europe would still be trapped in the Middle Ages. Peasants would still be serfs, bound to the land. The Renaissance might never have occurred. Democracy as we know it could have taken centuries longer to develop. Or maybe, without 200 million deaths, humanity would have advanced even faster. It all came down to a few infected rats on a handful of merchant ships in 1347. Let's explore what we lost, and what could have been. The Black Death wasn't one event. It was a wave of destruction that reshaped civilization. The plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas living on black rats. It spread along trade routes from Central Asia, through the Silk Road, into Europe via merchant ships. Once it arrived, it spread with terrifying speed. Entire villages were wiped out in weeks. Cities lost half their population in months. In some regions, 80% of people died. The symptoms were horrific. Victims developed painful swellings called buboes in their lymph nodes, especially in the groin, armpits, and neck. These turned black, hence the name Black Death. Fever, chills, vomiting blood. Death came within 3 to 7 days. But beyond the immediate horror, the plague fundamentally changed European society in ways that still define our world today. Before the plague, Europe was locked in a rigid feudal system. Peasants were serfs, legally bound to the land they worked. They had no freedom, no rights, no ability to leave. The nobility owned everything. The church controlled mines. Social mobility didn't exist. Then half the population died. Suddenly, labor became incredibly valuable. With so few workers left alive, peasants could demand wages. They could negotiate. They could move to new lords offering better conditions. For the first time in centuries, common people had leverage. Lords tried to suppress this. England passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It failed. Workers revolted. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 shook England to its core. The economic transformation was massive. Wages doubled, then tripled. The price of land collapsed. Serfdom began to crumble. A middle class emerged. The church, which had promised divine protection, lost credibility when prayers failed to stop the plague. People questioned religious authority for the first time in generations. This skepticism planted seeds for the Protestant Reformation 150 years later. Art and philosophy changed. With death so present, people became obsessed with mortality. This gave birth to new artistic movements, eventually feeding into the Renaissance. Medical knowledge advanced. Doctors, desperate to understand the plague, began systematic observation and experimentation. This was the beginning of modern scientific medicine. Universities expanded. With wealth redistributing and social mobility increasing, more people could afford education. In short, the Black Death destroyed the old medieval order and created the conditions for the modern world. Now, let's imagine it never happened. Or maybe, without 200 million deaths, humanity would have advanced even faster. It all came down to a few infected rats on a handful of merchant ships in 1347. Let's explore what we lost, and what could have been. Whatever the reason, the plague doesn't reach Europe. The 14th century continues as it began. The feudal system remains intact. Peasants stay bound to their land, generation after generation. The nobility maintains absolute control. Without the labor shortage, wages stay low. Serfdom persists for centuries longer. In our timeline, serfdom largely ended in Western Europe by 1500. In this timeline, it continues into the 1600s, maybe even the 1700s. Social mobility remains nearly impossible. The rigid class structure of medieval Europe endures. There's no economic disruption to crack open opportunities for common people. The Church maintains its unquestioned authority. Without the credibility crisis caused by failing to stop the plague, religious skepticism develops more slowly. Martin Luther's Reformation in 1517 either doesn't happen or has far less impact. Europe's population continues growing. By 1400, instead of 50 million people struggling to rebuild, there are 100 million people competing for limited resources. Farmland becomes scarce, food becomes expensive, pressure on resources intensifies. Here's where it gets interesting. More people means more labor, but also more mouths to feed. Without the Black Death's reset, medieval agriculture can't support the population. Famines become more frequent and severe. Wars intensify. More people means larger armies and more competition for land. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which in our timeline was affected by plague-depleted armies, now involves massive medieval battles with hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Technology advances slower. In our timeline, the labor shortage forced innovation. Expensive workers meant incentive to develop labor-saving devices. Printing press, advanced agriculture, water-powered mills, all accelerated by high labor costs. Without that pressure, there's less incentive to innovate. The printing press, invented in 1440 in our timeline, might not appear until 1550 or later. That's a century of delayed knowledge distribution. The Renaissance either doesn't happen or is drastically different. In our timeline, the Black Death's wealth redistribution funded artistic patronage. Merchants and bankers, grown wealthy from post-plague economics, commissioned art and supported scholars. Without that new wealth, the Renaissance might be a weak aristocratic movement rather than the explosion of creativity and learning that defined our timeline. Exploration develops differently. In our timeline, European exploration in the 1400s was partly driven by labor shortages and the need for new trade routes. With more people and less economic disruption, there's less urgency. Columbus might sail decades later, or not at all. Medical science advances slower. Without the plague forcing doctors to innovate and question old assumptions, medieval medicine continues relying on ancient texts and humoral theory, germ theory, antiseptics, vaccines, all delayed by centuries. By 1500, this alternate Europe looks fundamentally different. More people but poorer, more traditional but less dynamic, still medieval in structure with feudalism intact. Or maybe, without 200 million deaths, humanity would have advanced even faster. It all came down to a few infected rats on a handful of merchant ships in 1347. Let's explore what we lost and what could have been. So what would 2024 look like if the Black Death never happened? Let's start with the obvious. Europe would be more populated but significantly poorer and less developed. Without the economic transformation triggered by the plague, industrialization happens later. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the 1760s, was built on centuries of rising wages, labor-saving innovation, and capital accumulation, all accelerated by post-plague economics. In this timeline, the Industrial Revolution might not start until the 1850s or 1900s. That's over a century of delay, which means by 2024, global technology would be roughly at our 1920s level. No smartphones, no internet, no jet aircraft, maybe early computers in labs, but nothing consumer-facing. Population dynamics change dramatically. Without the Black Death, Europe's population grows continuously from 1347 onward. By 1500, instead of 80 million, there might be 150 million Europeans. By 1800, 400 million instead of 200 million. That population pressure drives different historical events. More Europeans means more intense colonization. When Europeans reach the Americas, they arrive in even greater numbers, making indigenous resistance even harder. But here's the twist. More people in Europe also means more poverty. Without the wage growth and social mobility triggered by the Black Death, The average European remains desperately poor for centuries longer. The Americas are colonized differently. With industrialization delayed and Europe more populated, colonial expansion focuses more on settlement than resource extraction. Instead of colonies feeding industrial metropoles, you get massive population transfers. By 1800, the Americas might have 100 million European settlers instead of 10 million. Democracy develops slower. In our timeline, the Black Death contributed to the decline of feudalism and the rise of individual rights. Without that, absolute monarchy and aristocratic privilege persist longer. The French Revolution in 1789 either doesn't happen or happens very differently. Perhaps democracy doesn't become the dominant system until the 20th century. Slavery potentially lasts longer. In our timeline, industrialization and changing labor economics made slavery increasingly unprofitable by the 1800s. With industrialization delayed, plantation slavery in the Americas might continue into the 20th century. Your personal life would be dramatically different. You'd likely be poorer. Class mobility would be limited. If your ancestors were peasants in 1347, your family might still be poor farmers in 2024. Education would be less accessible. The expansion of universities and literacy that followed the Black Death doesn't happen. Mass education, which became common in the 1800s and 1900s, might still be a privilege of the wealthy. Life expectancy would be lower. Medical advances delayed by centuries mean diseases we've conquered remain deadly. Average life expectancy might be 55 instead of 75, but there's a potential upside. Environmental damage could be less severe. With industrialization delayed by a century, we'd have had less time to burn fossil fuels. Climate change might be less advanced. Forests might be healthier. Species extinction might be reduced. Then again, with a much larger population competing for pre-industrial resources, deforestation and environmental degradation could actually be worse in some regions. Here's the most unsettling part. Without the Black Death, population pressure in medieval Europe could have triggered something even worse. Famine, war, and disease could have spiraled into a different catastrophe. Perhaps instead of one massive plague in 1347, you get continuous smaller epidemics and famines for centuries, creating a grinding poverty that's even worse than the Black Death's sharp shock. Or maybe, without the reset button of the plague, human ingenuity finds another path. Perhaps the pressure of overpopulation forces earlier agricultural innovations. Perhaps printing and literacy spread through different mechanisms. Perhaps democracy emerges from different revolutions. The truth is, the Black Death was a horror. 200 million people dead, families destroyed, civilizations shattered. But it also, paradoxically, liberated the survivors. It broke the chains of feudalism. It redistributed power. It forced innovation. Would we trade those gains to save 200 million lives? That's an impossible question. But what we know for certain is that the Black Death was a hinge point in history. Without it, the entire trajectory of human civilization pivots toward a world we might not recognize. Medical science advances slower. Without the plague forcing doctors to innovate and question old assumptions, medieval medicine continues relying on ancient texts and humoral theory. Germ theory, antiseptics, vaccines, all delayed by centuries. By 1500, this alternate Europe looks fundamentally different. More people, but poorer. More traditional, but less dynamic. Still medieval in structure, with feudalism intact. Or maybe, without 200 million deaths, humanity would have advanced even faster. It all came down to a few infected rats on a handful of merchant ships in 1347. Let's explore what we lost and what could have been. The Black Death remains one of history's greatest tragedies. 200 million people dead in just 6 years. Entire generations wiped out. The horror was unimaginable. But from that horror came transformation. The end of feudalism, the rise of the individual, the seeds of democracy, science, and the modern world. Change that one moment, prevent that one plague, and you don't just save lives. You freeze Europe in the Middle Ages for centuries longer. You delay progress. You trap millions more in poverty and servitude. It's the darkest paradox in history, a catastrophe that killed a third of humanity, but also freed the survivors to build something new. So here's my question for you. Are there other disasters that horrifically pushed humanity forward? What other dark turning points changed everything? What other what-if should we explore next? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into alternate history, hit that subscribe button, because we're diving into the timelines that could have been. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next timeline. Would we trade those gains to save 200 million lives? That's an impossible question. But what we know for certain is that the Black Death was a hinge point in history. Without it, the entire trajectory of human civilization pivots toward a world we might not recognize. Medical science advances slower. Without the plague forcing doctors to innovate and question old assumptions, medieval medicine continues relying on ancient texts and humoral theory. Germ theory, antiseptics, vaccines, all delayed by centuries. By 1500, this alternate Europe looks fundamentally different. More people, but poorer. More traditional, but less dynamic. Still medieval in structure, with feudalism intact. Or maybe, without 200 million deaths, humanity would have advanced even faster. It all came down to a few infected rats on a handful of merchant ships in 1347. Let's explore what we lost and what could have been.